This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories. 1 week to a high-stakes Trump-Xi summit. China says ties with the U.S. are steady despite disruption, while Beijing reportedly moves to pause new loans to U.S.-sanctioned refiners. Now, a diplomatic flashpoint over Taiwan. Paraguayan President Santiago Peña has landed in the island for talks on investment and cooperation. But Beijing now urging the South American leader to sever ties with Taipei. Also, crisis on the agenda as the ASEAN Summit opens in Cebu. The Middle East conflict is testing food and energy security, and the bloc chair, the Philippines, says the region must be ready for what comes next. And confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran says it shot down a U.S. reconnaissance drone, while Washington fired on an Iranian tanker. All this as President Trump says the conflict could end soon. And Japanese stocks on a tear, with the Nikkei benchmark jumping the most in more than a year and closing at a record high. Also ahead on the bulletin, the Samsung family fortune going from strength to strength. Despite paying a whopping tax bill, we'll delve into how they managed these gains. And a fresh round of public hearings pulls Hong Kong's deadliest fire in decades back in the spotlight. More than 160 people were killed, including 9 Indonesian domestic workers. We look at the lasting impact on grieving families still searching for answers. China says that ties with the U.S. have remained largely stable despite what it calls twists and disruptions. It comes ahead of next week's highly anticipated summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in Beijing. Our top diplomat Wang Yi making the remarks during a meeting with a U.S. bipartisan congressional delegation led by Senator Steve Daines. Mr. Daines, a Trump ally, says that the two nations should seek to ease tensions over their differences instead of cutting ties. The Chinese foreign minister, meanwhile, credited Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump for steering the direction of relations at critical moments.
我们愿意同美方共同努力，把两国元首的共识落到实处，让中美关系真正稳下来、好起来，从而造福两国。
I strongly believe that we want to de-escalate, not decouple. We want stability. We want mutual respect.
Meanwhile, Chinese Premier Li Qiang says that his country is ready to deepen exchanges and expand cooperation with the U.S. across a range of areas. Now, the remarks come as Beijing appears to be moving to smooth over potential friction points ahead of Mr. Trump's visit next week. Bloomberg, citing people familiar with the matter, says that China's financial regulator has advised the nation's largest banks to temporarily suspend new loans to 5 refiners recently sanctioned by the U.S. over their ties to Iranian oil. Now, the reported verbal directive came before last weekend's instructions from China's Commerce Ministry for firms to disregard American sanctions. Commerce officials also invoked a 2021 blocking measure for the first time, one that's designed to shield Chinese companies from what Beijing considers unjustified foreign laws. And Washington and Beijing are also reportedly exploring ways to manage their tech rivalry. The Wall Street Journal quoting unnamed sources who said the U.S. and China are considering official discussions on artificial intelligence aimed at preventing their competition from spiraling into crisis. A report also says the two superpowers are aiming to mitigate AI risks, including unexpected behavior from autonomous military systems and attacks by non-state actors using open-source tools. Now, the White House and the Chinese government also mulling putting AI on the agenda for the upcoming Trump-Xi summit. But key red lines remain, including Taiwan. Taipei says that Beijing may try some maneuvering over the Taiwan issue with the U.S. leader, but stresses that Washington has reaffirmed its policy on the island remains unchanged. Taiwan says it will be watching closely for any signals that Mr. Trump could soften or reframe the position in exchange for Chinese deals. Now, China has called on Paraguay to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan as the president of the South American nation makes a visit to the island for a 4-day trip.
我们奉劝巴拉圭当局早日站到历史正确一边，做出承认一个中国原则，同台湾当局断绝所谓外交关系的正确抉择。
Paraguayan President Santiago Peña, meanwhile, has hailed his country's ties with Taiwan. He will hold talks with President William Lai on investment opportunities and cooperation in areas including technology, education, and transportation. Paraguay is Taiwan's only diplomatic ally in South America. Beijing has been ramping up pressure on the island's remaining 12 allies to switch recognition from Taipei to China. The US and Iran trade fire in the Strait of Hormuz amid concerns about continued confrontations may derail peace efforts. While Iran says it shot down a combat reconnaissance drone over the waterway, Iran's Revolutionary Guard released this footage showing the wreckage. Reuters news agency, citing an arms expert, says that the object appears to be part of a drone type operated by the US. Well, the US, meanwhile, has shot at and disabled an Iranian-flagged oil tanker trying to break its blockade. Washington has warned its blockade on Iranian ports remains in full effect after President Donald Trump suspended an operation to escort vessels through Hormuz. And all of this comes despite the US leader playing up the prospect of a quick end to the conflict, amid reports that both sides are close to an agreement on a one-page memorandum. Washington has expressed hopes that it can open the door to longer-term negotiations and end the conflict in the region. The U.S. leader, however, threatened to resume bombing Iran at a much higher level and intensity if it does not agree to a deal. Iran is currently reviewing a 14-point U.S. proposal, which reportedly includes a moratorium on Iranian nuclear enrichment and the lifting of restrictions on transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Sanctions relief and release of frozen Iranian assets are also reportedly among other provisions. Now, Iran's foreign ministry says that it will convey its response on the proposal soon through mediator Pakistan. Meanwhile, Iran has denied involvement in damage to a South Korean-operated cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the incident involved the HMM Namu, a Panama-flagged vessel that suffered an explosion and caught fire on Monday. The ship was carrying 24 crew members when the blast happened in the key waterway. U.S. President Donald Trump later said that the vessel had been shot at by Iran, but Tehran insists the allegations are false. South Korea has maintained a cautious stance over the cause of the explosion. A special South Korean government team has been sent to Dubai to investigate the incident. Officials say the probe could take several days and that it's too early to determine the cause. Well, for now, tensions in the Middle East continue to raise concerns over global energy supplies and shipping routes. In response, Seoul is extending its ban on hoarding petroleum products for another 2 months. The measure was first introduced in March to prevent stockpiling and unfair pricing practices. Authorities say the aim is to keep essential goods, including fuel, food, and medical supplies, stable. A South Korean appeals court has reduced the prison sentence of former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo over his role in ex-President Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration. Now, Han was originally sentenced to 23 years in prison, but Seoul Appeals Court has cut that term to 15 years. The court upheld most of Han's convictions, saying he'd had abandoned his responsibility and sided with those involved in acts of insurrection. The judges said that there was limited evidence that he had planned the declaration in advance or even led the operation. Yoon's martial law order in December 2024 briefly suspended civilian rule, but lasted only about 6 hours before lawmakers voted to overturn. Han later chaired a cabinet meeting to rescind the decree. The ruling is the latest in a series of appeals involving figures close to Yoon, who's already serving a life sentence for leading the insurrection. South Korea says that it will continue peace efforts with the North following Pyongyang's decision to remove all references to reunification in its constitution. The presidential office says it will consistently pursue its peaceful coexistence policy for the peninsula and review the North's latest revision. Pyongyang's constitution previously mentioned it was seeking the reunification of the homeland, but that clause is no longer in the latest document. Instead, it newly defines North Korean territory without any reference to the South. Leader Kim Jong-un shifted the country's policy in 2023, naming the South as a separate country instead of a partner for eventual unification. However, South Korea's spy agency says Pyongyang tamped down its hostility towards its neighbor, stopping short of describing Seoul as an enemy. South Korea's own constitution mentions its commitment to peaceful unification. The two Koreas are technically still at war since the 1950-53 conflict ended without a peace treaty. Well, North Korea says it's not bound by any nuclear non-proliferation treaty, despite international pressure and sanctions over its weapons program. Pyongyang's UN envoy made the remarks at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, where North Korea's nuclear arsenal was a major focus. He described attempts to force the country to comply with the treaty as a wanton violation of international law, stressing that the North's status as a nuclear-armed state will not change. The envoy said the status is now enshrined in North Korea's constitution, with the laws governing the use of nuclear weapons. Pyongyang first announced plans to withdraw from the treaty in 1993 before formally leaving in 2003. Since then, it has conducted half a dozen nuclear tests, triggering a raft of international sanctions. Analysts believe North Korea now possesses dozens of nuclear warheads. Time now for a short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese company earnings sliding for a third straight year, with sluggish domestic consumption and the drag from the embattled property market. And Maersk's first quarter results sail past analysts' forecasts, but warns of a cloudier outlook going forward. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is now time for your business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, Japanese stocks are apparently blazing to new heights, and that's the first day after the country's Golden Week holiday. Tell us what's driving that.
Well, the Japanese market is playing catch-up, of course, as over-optimism, the global tech sector, and there's also renewed hope for a peace deal in the Middle East. The benchmark Nikkei 225 broke through that 63,000 mark for the first time in intraday trade, with the index jumping more than 5% by the close. The benchmark ended today close to that 63,000 mark. Among the top gainers, SoftBank, a major investor in AI firms, as well as Japanese chip testing equipment maker Advantest and the country's top chip maker, Tokyo Electron. The country's currency weakness, however, still in the spotlight, the yen hovering around the 156 level. Now, its continuing weakness against the greenback prompting the nation's top currency diplomat to say that there are, quote, no constraints on how often it can intervene, and that the government is in daily contact with U.S. authorities. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is reportedly set to meet Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi next week to discuss curbing speculative yen selling, among other issues. An analyst pointed to one of the big drivers of the weaker yen. Have a listen.
The big problem with JPY right now and facing the BOJ is energy imports. Everything is imported, of course. And so, and those energy imports are dollar denominated. So part of the reason that Bessent is going to Japan could potentially be to discuss swap lines with Japan, which means providing US dollar liquidity to Japan to buy energy. So what kind of a second order issue that triggers in me is maybe Bessent is thinking that the war might last a little bit longer and we might have energy prices for a little bit longer. I don't know, but if he's headed there, then they're probably having serious discussions about dollar liquidity and yen valuation and levels. So the coordination that the U.S. did with the UAE last week on dollar swap lines is definitely something that would be on the cards for Japan as well.
Chip-related stocks in South Korea also helping to push the benchmark Kospi index to another record high. The Kospi closed the day just shy of the 7,500 level. Now it's risen more than 77% so far this year. Driving much of those gains, tech stocks like Samsung Electronics, which has jumped 2% today, entering firmly into the $1 trillion club. But behind that rally is another story. The family that controls Samsung has just finished paying South Korea's largest ever inheritance tax bill, but their fortune continues to rise. CNA's Grace Shin explains.
South Korea's inheritance tax was once seen as a threat to the Lee family's grip on the conglomerate. Instead, they're now richer than ever. $8.1 billion US. That's the inheritance tax bill Samsung's Lee family has just finished paying, following the death of Samsung patriarch Lee Kon-hee in 2020. It's the largest inheritance tax payment in South Korean history, roughly 46% of Lee's reported estate value. And for Samsung's ruling family, this was not just a tax problem, it was a control problem. The hefty bill raised concerns because Samsung is not just another company. It's South Korea's biggest chaebol, one of the family-run conglomerates that dominate the country's economy. 7 key Samsung affiliates generate revenue equivalent to almost a fifth of South Korea's GDP. But the Lee family does not own all of Samsung. It controls the group by holding just enough of the right shares like most other chaebol. That's why the tax bill mattered. Much of the family's wealth was tied up in Samsung-linked shares, not cash. If it had sold too many of those shares to pay the tax, its grip could have weakened. So how did the Lees avoid that? Well, they bought time. The bill was paid over 5 years in 6 installments. Some family members sold Samsung shares. Lee Jae-yong relied more on loans backed by shares and other assets. Dividends also helped. By the time the final payment was due, most of the burden had already been managed, but AI changed the ending. AI data centers need fast memory chips. That's Samsung Electronics' core business. As demand for advanced memory surged, investors piled in. Samsung Electronics has crossed $1 trillion in market value, becoming only the second Asian company after TSMC to do so. Lee family's combined wealth reportedly jumped from about $20 billion to more than $45 billion in a single year. That pushed them from Asia's 10th richest family to 3rd. That's the core of this story. The family survived the tax bill, then AI and Korea's market rally made it much richer. For investors, Samsung makes South Korea harder to ignore. AI demand is feeding profits and record market gains. Governance reforms are also making Korean stocks look more attractive. But Samsung's case shows the other side. A higher share price makes the Lee family richer today, but it could also make the next succession more expensive.
Something happens to Mr. J.Y. Lee now, the family has to pay a humongous inheritance tax according to the tax law. So the increase of stock price is good for any family, but they also have to be mindful that their tax liability become larger. So that's the reason why the Korean chaebol, they usually do not like the increase of stock price. They want to depress it to reduce the inherent tax liability.
The Lee family managed the tax. AI lifted what it still owned, but the same rally that made the family richer could make the next handover harder.
Meantime, China's corporate earnings are down for the 3rd straight year as the country's economy continues to be weighed down by weak domestic consumption and a years-long property slump. Nikkei reports that more than a quarter of non-financial listed companies recorded net losses, which is the worst showing on record. Now, total net profit for the financial year ended December was also 2% lower on year. China's developers continue to be mired by sluggish property sales, with more than half of real estate companies posting losses, widening from the year before. More than a third of retailers also ended the financial year in the red, double that over the same period. But industries catering for overseas demand performed better, with exports to Southeast Asia setting records, and semiconductors also riding the global AI boom, with Capricorn, sometimes referred to as China's Nvidia, finally turning a profit. Analysts say economic recovery in the world's second-largest economy, if any, will be led by external demand. Now, Singapore's third biggest bank, UOB, is looking to double its wealth income by 2030, with a closer focus on Greater China, including Hong Kong, as well as ASEAN. That's as it sees wealth flows from areas such as the Middle East as, quote, not so obvious at this point in time. The focus on this new growth area comes after its first quarter results showed a decline in net profit. Lower interest rate environment dented the bank's lending income. Net profit for the January to March quarter fell 4% on year to 1.4 billion Singapore dollars. And that's slightly higher than the bank's earnings in the last quarter, in line with market estimates. Net interest income fell 4%, mainly due to the lower domestic interest rates. Now, the lender's net fee income also eased 8% from last year's record high, as investment banking, wealth management and card fees moderated amid cautious market sentiment. Looking ahead, UOB CEO Wang Yi said that the bank expects low single-digit loan growth in 2026 amid the global uncertainty. He adds they'll shift towards fee-led growth, projecting that fee income will expand in the high single digits this year. Now, oil prices tumbling more than 2% on renewed hopes of a peace deal in the Middle East. Brent crude currently down by 2.3%, $98.93 a barrel. U.S. market, a West Texas Intermediate, is also down by 2.5%, $92.65, extending losses from yesterday's slump of more than 7% and reaching two-week lows. Meantime, gas prices also headed in a similar direction, with the Dutch benchmark down by nearly 3%, $42.60. The International Energy Agency says that the Iran war has cut the LNG supply by about 15%, but a strong increase in new liquefaction capacity expected to offset lost volumes from Qatar and the UAE. Danish shipping giant Maersk beat first quarter forecast with an operating profit of more than $1.7 billion. But it's warning of uncertainty over freight rates and costs due to the Middle East conflict. The company's CEO said that higher oil prices raised expenses by around $500 million a month, with costs likely to be passed on to customers. Maersk shares down more than 4% following the results, underperforming the broadly flat Copenhagen benchmark index. Emirates reports record results in its latest financial year despite the war in the Middle East grounding part of its aircraft fleet in the final month of the financial year. Revenue came in at $35.7 billion. That's up 2% from the previous year. Profit after tax rose 3% over the same period to $5.4 billion. The Dubai carrier said that the results reflects strong and sustained travel demand across regions. Emirates also said it has enough fuel to resume full operations despite the global jet fuel shortage. And that is the latest in business for now.
Thanks so very much, Roland. All right, we're going to go for a break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, bereaved families still searching for answers months after Hong Kong's deadly Typhoon fire claimed the lives of more than 160 people. Our correspondent visited one family as part of our series examining the disaster's lasting impact. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. 1 week to a high-stakes Trump-Xi summit, and China says ties with the U.S. are steady despite disruption, as American senators urge cooperation between the two superpowers. Now, the U.S. and Iran trade fire over the Strait of Hormuz as peace efforts to end hostilities continue. Tehran says it shot down a U.S. reconnaissance drone while Washington fired at an Iranian tanker. And the Philippines calls on ASEAN to be better prepared to handle emergencies and crises, as the global energy crisis caused by the war on Iran cast a shadow on the summit in Cebu. Now, China's military court has reportedly sentenced former defense ministers Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe to death with a 2-year reprieve over graft charges. And more on that breaking news out of China. State media says China's military court found both former defense ministers guilty of accepting bribes. Their sentences were separately handed down by China's military court. And according to the court rulings, Wei was convicted of accepting bribes, while Li was convicted of both accepting and offering bribes. They were also stripped of their political rights for life. Both men were expelled from the Communist Party in 2024 for, quote, serious violations of discipline. Their sentences will be commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of a commutation or parole only if they don't commit any crimes during the 2-year reprieve period. Our correspondent in China will have more on this story on Asia Tonight at 8 p.m. Singapore-Hong Kong time. Now, in Hong Kong, a fresh round of public hearings into last November's deadly Wang Fuk court fire is taking place this week. 3 rounds have been held so far, and we heard testimony from residents and government officials, and this is what has emerged so far. The housing complex was being renovated when the fire broke out, and scaffolding used to cover the towers did not pass safety standards. There were also other fire hazards used during the renovation, which escaped inspection by government agencies. The fire department could have activated an emergency alert, but it declined to do so, fearing that it could cause alarm. Well, the fire eventually killed 168 people, including a fireman who died in the line of duty. 10 of those who died were foreign domestic workers, 9 of them from Indonesia, where a growing number of domestic workers hail from. Our CNA's Chatni Vatvani spoke to the families of one of the Indonesian workers who died in the fire.
I'm Chatni Vatvani, and I'm traveling to Blitar, which was home for Sri Wayuni. It's about 5 hours by road from the provincial capital, Surabaya. There, her family are visiting her grave. It's been nearly 6 months since Miss Wahyuni died in the Taipo fire, her body found hugging that of her 93-year-old employer. It was the very first time Miss Wahyuni had left home to work overseas.
Yayu itu, katanya kejadian di apartemen istri saya itu. Saya tidak percaya, terus dikasih videonya itu, saya langsung panik gitu. Bingung kan, mau telepon siapa, sana mau telepon sini, tidak ada nomor, kan bingung saya. Jadinya pikiran itu kayak kacau, Mbak. Gitu.
At their home, I saw family pictures on the wall. One stood out, a bigger frame encompassing 4 smaller ones. Pictures of Miss Wahyuni with her employer, and scenes from their time together in Hong Kong.
Dikasih album gitu, banyak fotonya, kenangan. Ada.
On the very first page of the album, they wrote, "In the past 2 years, our family was blessed with a kind and selfless guardian angel."
And that excerpt you just watched there is from the latest CNA correspondent episode, Hong Kong Fire, The Search for Answers, which debuts tonight on CNA. Well, Chatni Vatvani is back in Jakarta, and she joins us now to unpack more of that story. Chatni, in the story we saw there, you mentioned that they waited nearly a month before they got to bury Sri Wahyuni. That must have been quite a distressing situation for them. Can you just walk us through it?
Absolutely. The family did wait 29 days before they received Sri Wahyuni's body and could proceed with the burial process. And those were, actually some of the hardest days for them. You had the aftermath of the fire, that shock that they had lost their loved one to such an incident, the fact that such an incident had even happened in the first place, and, having lost her in a foreign country as well. So there was a lot of confusion, and we heard from her husband how his mind was in a mess in the aftermath. And there were so many questions as well for the family. How to get her body back, whom to even contact, and where to even begin. And in Indonesia, essentially, when someone passes away, they would be buried within 1 or 2 days at the most for Muslims. But the bodies were in Hong Kong for investigation for some 3 weeks. And so there certainly was panic among the families here of the domestic workers, including Sri Wayuni's family.
So, Chani, you traveled quite a fair bit to get to the family home. Could you just give us a sense of what conditions there are like compared with, say, big cities such as Jakarta, and what drives them to leave behind their families?
Well, Sri Wayuni's family were based in Blitar, which is a city in East Java. We are based in Jakarta, which is located in a different province altogether. And as we know, Jakarta is also the capital of Indonesia. So to get to Blitar, we flew to Surabaya, which is the provincial capital of East Java. And then we made our way to Blitar by road, which took us about 5 hours one way, based on the road and traffic conditions. Now, if we compare Blitar and Jakarta, Jakarta is considered to be the economic, political, and financial hub of the country. Now, this means that it attracts a myriad of people, both locals and expats, all looking for opportunities. Having said that, it is also congested both in terms of population and traffic. And it's not uncommon to see many Indonesians making hours-long commutes to get to work, and in many situations, for inadequate wages. So that's the situation that we have locally. This means that Indonesian migrant workers are increasingly looking for better employment opportunities outside the country, and they're driven then by a combination of limited formal job prospects here at home, low wage levels, and of course the pursuit of higher income. Now, all of that was also true in Sri Wayuni's case. Her husband shared with us that this was her very first time working overseas, and that they arrived at this decision. It was her effort to help support their family. But of course, this was no means an easy decision at all. There was a lot of reluctance, and she had to leave behind not just her husband, but her 3 children as well. And while we were there, there was evidence that having this job did indeed support her family. Her daughter shared with us that within 2 months of taking up this job in Hong Kong, they were able to buy a car, they were able to buy a motorcycle, and they were even able to renovate their home. But of course, at the time, they didn't realize that it would have come, it came rather at a very great cost.
And as you've mentioned, the poverty and living conditions driving a sizable number of women in these communities to head abroad as domestic workers. But do you think an incident like this, the Type 05, would have impacted their decision to work abroad now?
Well, I can't speak for everyone collectively, but it certainly did impact Sri Wayuni's family, specifically. I was told by her mother-in-law that upon this incident happening, her mother asked all of her children, the ones working overseas, to come back home. Her daughter also spoke to me and said that she initially did have dreams of joining her mother in Hong Kong. But upon this incident happening, she has certainly no intentions of going overseas as well. And of course, if we look at government data, you mentioned earlier about a lot of women going overseas for work. And if we do look at government data, it shows that in 2025, over 187,000 Indonesian women were officially placed as migrant workers abroad. And I want to share a couple of things. Firstly, that this continues a trend where women dominate the foreign domestic workforce. And second, domestic staff constituted the largest single profession, accounting approximately nearly 77,000 individuals, or some 26% of all of the recorded placements that year, while caregivers or care workers constituted over 53,000 individuals. Now, the majority of these workers originate from Java, and top destinations in 2025 include Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Malaysia.
And, Chatni, I imagine Wayuni's family, on top of the stress and it's so sad to lose a family member. But they're also facing other obstacles now in terms of trying to retrieve compensation money, right? And as your story earlier mentioned, it's not as simple as a wire transfer. So walk us through the situation and also what some of the challenges the families face.
That's absolutely right. In delicate situations like this one, it really isn't as simple as doing or receiving a wire transfer. There's oftentimes a mountain of paperwork, which understandably, it needs to be supported by documentation and evidence, whether that is provided by the grieving family who's already going through their own motions of the grieving process, or, with them being supported by NGOs or other organizations helping these families through the process. Now, at the same time, when other elements like donations or other forms of help additionally also start to trickle into grieving families, oftentimes they find themselves in impossible situations. So you have, on the one hand, the compensation that is meant to arrive to them, and on the other hand, other forms of, whether it be monetary or other forms of help, right, aid. And so they potentially then have to deal with scammers, for example, who are then targeting families even before the bodies of their loved ones are sent home, or even people in their own communities who would potentially come out of the woodwork and lay claim or feel entitled to a share, so to speak. So it's really quite a challenge and an emotional and mental, process or roller coaster, if you will, in order to finally acquire their compensation. The journey there is really not that simple.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that story, that heartfelt story, no less. CNA's Chani Vatvani with us there from Jakarta. And of course, we've got more of Sri Wayuni's story in CNA correspondent this week. It's an hour-long special, and it catches up with the survivors on the devastating tragedy and the search for answers into what caused Hong Kong's worst fire in recent memory. Once again, do catch it on our website, cna.asia, or on our mobile app. On that note, we are going to zip out for a short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, once the biggest travelling season, Japan's Golden Week sees a dip in average budget and a lack in enthusiasm from the public. We take a look at what's dampening the festive mood. The energy crisis unfolding due to the conflict in the Middle East taking center stage at the ASEAN Leaders Summit. The bloc's chair, the Philippines, says that the group needs to be better prepared to handle emergencies and crises. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Maria Teresa Lazaro, speaking to foreign ministers at the start of the two-day summit in Cebu, described the war in Iran as a timely opportunity to assess the group's progress on urgent priorities, including protecting food and energy security.
For ASEAN, which imports about 66% of its crude oil, this crisis meant significant increase in fuel and energy cost, which eventually led to higher prices for agricultural inputs, food and basic commodities. The crisis also caused disruptions in some sectors, including transportation and tourism, and put at risk millions of ASEAN nationals in the Middle East.
Meanwhile, leaders of Thailand and Cambodia are also meeting on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit. The two neighbours engaged in deadly fighting last year, if you recall, and a current ceasefire holds with no formal resolution. The Philippines is taking part in the talks as well. Now, for the very latest, let's go to CNA's senior correspondent, Leong Wai-kit. He joins us live from the summit in Cebu, Philippines. Wai-kit, so just walk us through what some of the highlights, what came out of those trilateral talks among Thailand, Cambodia and the Philippines.
Well, those trilateral talks started at 6 p.m., just the same time we began our East Asia Tonight program. And the three leaders are slated to meet members of the media to give us an update once those meetings wrapped up. I've been refreshing my phone. There have been no updates as yet. What I can tell you is that this trilateral meeting follows a model or formula, if you will, from last year. You mentioned earlier, this started last year, Oteli, and when this conflict erupted last year, then ASEAN Chair, Mr. Anwar Ibrahim, immediately picked up the phone to call the leaders of both Thailand and Cambodia in a bid to simmer tensions. And there have been several ceasefires attempted, the latest being in December last year. And since then, there have been no major flare-ups or major deaths that occurred since December. But there are still many cracks to cement, if you will, including your trust-building and confidence-building measures. Remember, there are tens of thousands of families on both sides of the border. I've been to the Cambodian side several times, seeing how close these families live in the border. My colleague Saksit Sayasombat has gone to the Thai side. So these families really need the stability of the border to live their lives normally. But analysts I speak to also say that there's an extra political dimension to this. They say that if ASEAN were to appear united to tackle challenges externally, then internally they must also settle their domestic issues, including your Myanmar crisis and this Thai-Cambodia border conflict.
And that's why, Waikit, typically at these summits, a lot of bilateral meetings taking place on the sidelines. Do we know what has emerged from some of them?
Well, some of the key meetings today include your ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, as well as a combined foreign affairs and economic affairs meeting. Now, such meetings are relatively new features in ASEAN summits because this feature emerged last year when there is an important need to have a unified response to challenges such as tariffs. This time round in Cebu, the foreign affairs and economic ministers are discussing your fallout from your Middle East crisis, and ASEAN Chair Philippines had said that geopolitics would affect elements like your energy security, your food stability, as well as your rising costs. So it's important for the economic ministers to hear from their foreign affairs counterparts so that they have, a calibrated response, anticipated risks, as well as be able to test out several scenarios within the bloc, what works, what does not. At the end of the meeting, there was a statement pushed out, not many details, but the broad strokes were proposals such as diversifying your energy routes, as well as improving your ASEAN trade links.
And I know we've got a busy evening ahead. I shall leave you to it. Thanks so very much for those updates. CNA's Leong Waikit speaking to us live from the ASEAN Summit in Cebu, Philippines. Over the last 8 days, Japan celebrated Golden Week, a string of public holidays and typically the biggest traveling season. But this year, roughly a third of Japanese didn't plan to do anything at all. And the average Golden Week budget is also down 5% from last year, lower than even the first year after COVID. The reason? Inflation and the weakening yen. Now, on the surface, Japan's economy appears to be recovering. Wages are up. The Nikkei has hit record highs, and tourists are flooding in. And for the first time, Japan has a female prime minister, one who has staked her mandate on turning the economy around. CNA's weekly current affairs program, Insight, asks, is Japan finally headed for an economic turnaround? Or will these signs of life sputter out?
Today, 久しぶりに私がお店をやっていた場所に来ました。懐かしいです。なんか毎日通ってた時のことを思い出しながら見てます。
Yui Sawada used to run a cafe here, selling candy apples, light snacks, and hot meals.
一応今シャッターは閉まってるんですけど、開げると始めたのは2024年の8月オープン。オープンした時はお米が5キロに1キュッパとかいってでなので2025年10月1年経ってもうそれこそもう令和の米騒動が年末にあってでお米売り出したと思ったらもう倍額とかもう本当に3倍とか砂糖の方が上がっててオープンした時は本当に1袋100に安くて110円とか105円とかだったんですけど今はもう普通に200円オーバーするので1キロで。
Sawada tried to cut costs, using cheaper ingredients, shortening her business hours. In the end, she had no choice but to raise prices.
一番メジャーで言うと、リンゴ飴なんですけどオープンの時は490円で販売してたものを、最終的には530円に値上げをしたんですけどやっぱり学生が女子高生たちが490円じゃなかったの500円で買えないのもうそこにレジの前に立っちゃってるんで買ってるんですけどその後来たかっていうと来てないかもしれないですね。はい、やっぱり値上げせんかったらよかったかなってちょっと思いました。はい。
4 years ago, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Since Ukraine is a major producer of grain,
The war disrupted the production and export of grain from Ukraine, and this led to an increase in grain prices throughout the world. And at the same time, foreign countries imposed various sanctions on Russia, one of which was on the export of oil and gas. And this led to a sharp increase in oil and gas prices around the world. And this also had a ripple effect on other prices and led to, overall increase in overall prices.
At the same time, the low interest rate environment meant to spur borrowing and growth has led to a depreciation of the yen.
And that has led to a sharp increase in import prices. And that has had a ripple effect on the economy, causing all prices to increase in Japan.
People suffered from high imported prices. Their purchasing power was deteriorating.
Accounting for inflation, real wages in Japan fell for the fourth year in a row last year. Consequently, unions pushed for higher pay. So, in October last year, Japan implemented a major minimum wage increase from 1,055 yen to between 1,118 and 1,120 yen. This bump of roughly 6% was the largest on record. But for business owners like Sawada, this was another headache.
価格も上がって原価率も上がってるのに人件費も上がるんかっていうのでちょっと悩みました。削るそのシフトを削るっていうのはできるだけしたくなかったんですけど、でもやっぱり続けていく以上苦渋の決断でした。
Earlier this year, unable to keep up with operating costs, Sawada turned her business into a pop-up. Going mobile, cut her rent. One important ingredient in any economic revival is sentiment. When people and businesses feel optimistic, they're more likely to spend and invest. In Japan, however, confidence remains subdued. A government survey found that financial insecurity is the top concern among citizens, with over 6 in 10 people worried about their economic stability and future prospects. But are we starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Our question is, can Japan's new leadership turn 3 lost decades into a genuine revival? Or will internal and external pressures derail any momentum? Well, we can catch the Insight episode, Japan's Economic Turnaround, tonight at 9 p.m. on CNA. And you can also catch up on CNA Video On Demand or CNA Insider's YouTube page. And on that note, we wrap up Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, for more headlines, you can tune in anytime at cna.asia. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow.